Okay, so, we've been looking at some pretty intense stuff lately. And this time you've brought us some sources that dive right into a huge question. I mean, are we actually seeing a constitutional crisis happening right now in the U.S.?
Yeah, and specifically, we're looking at this through the actions of the Trump administration,
Mm,
these recent actions they've taken.
right. We've got legal scholars weighing in. We've got news analysis breaking it down. Really a whole spectrum of
It's a
perspectives.
lot to unpack for sure.
And, the goal here is to really break it down for everyone listening. You know, help make sense of these complex arguments.
Yeah, because it gets pretty complicated.
Is this really like a fundamental break in how our government is supposed to work?
Right, like are we going off
Right.
the rails here?
Or is this, just a really, really heated political battle that's still, being fought within the rules of the game?
Yeah, are we bending or breaking the system? That's the core question.
Exactly. And I think to even start tackling that, we have to wrestle with this term itself, right? This idea of a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, it's one of those phrases that gets thrown around a lot these days.
Like, what does it even really mean?
Right, like at what point do we say, okay, this is more than just a political disagreement?
Right. When does tension between different parts of the government actually become a crisis?
That's the key. And, some really smart legal minds have thought about this a lot, like Sanford Levinson and Jack Balkin.
I've read some of their work. It's fascinating.
Yeah, they've pointed out that, just having conflict between different branches of government, that's not enough to call it a crisis. I mean, the system's kind of designed to have some friction built in, right?
Right. Checks and balances and all that.
Exactly. It's supposed to be a bit of a tug of war in some ways, but what Levinson and Balkin say is the real crisis point comes when one branch just straight up defies another.
Oh, wow. So like outright refusal to cooperate.
Yeah. Or even more fundamental than that, they say a crisis emerges when the Constitution itself just doesn't have a clear answer for how to resolve a conflict.
So it's like the rule book doesn't have a rule for this situation.
Exactly. And that's when things get really dicey. It's about the system breaking down.
And, when we were looking at the news coverage, CNN's legal analyst, Eli Honig, had a pretty stark way of putting it.
Yeah, he was very blunt. He said, the moment you see open defiance of a court order, that's when you know you're in real trouble.
Wow. That's a strong statement.
It is. And I think for anyone listening, it really underscores how crucial respect for the courts is in our system.
Right. The idea that the executive branch, the president, can't just ignore what the judicial branch decides.
Exactly. That's one of those bedrock principles that this whole thing rests on.
And that leads us to the specific situation that you flagged for this deep dive, these deportation policies from the Trump administration.
Right. So let's get into the details.
Paint us a picture of what happened.
Okay. So the administration basically invoked these wartime powers to speed up the deportation of a group of people who they identified as mostly Venezuelan and alleged gang members.
Venezuelan gang members.
Yeah, and they were being deported to El Salvador.
Yeah. Okay. And so this obviously got challenged in court, right?
Immediately. And a U.S. District Judge, James Boasberg, he issued an order to stop those planes in their tracks.
Yeah.
Turn them around. Don't deport those people.
And that's where things get really murky, right?
Exactly, because now we have these two completely different interpretations of what happened next.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So the administration, the White House, their argument is that those deportations were already done before the judge's order came through.
So it's like, oh, well, too late. They're already gone.
Exactly. And they point to this social media post from El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele. He actually posted footage of the deportees arriving.
Oh, wow. So like proof that they had already landed.
Exactly. That's their side of the story timing, was everything, the order came too late.
But of course, the critics see it very differently.
Totally. They're saying, no way this was deliberate. They think the administration knew this court order was coming,
Yeah.
and they rushed those deportations to basically dodge the whole judicial review process.
Yeah. So it's like they knew they were about to be told no, and they just did it anyway.
That's the accusation. And, it raises some really big questions about respect for the courts and for the legal process as a whole.
Okay, so let's dig into those arguments a little deeper. The arguments for why this situation, some people are saying this qualifies as a full-blown constitutional crisis. And the first one is this alleged defiance of court orders.
Right, and this is a big one because it strikes at the heart of our whole system, the rule of law, the separation of powers.
It's like that Schoolhouse rock song, I'm Just a Bill. Yeah, I remember.
Exactly. Our system is built on this idea that everyone has to follow the law, even the president. And it's the courts, the judicial branch, that get to interpret and enforce those laws.
So if the president can just ignore a court order, it kind of unravels the whole thing.
Exactly. And that's why that quote from White House advisor Stephen Miller was so alarming.
I remember remember that one. He basically said a district court judge can't tell the president what to do when it comes to expelling terrorists.
Yeah, very strong words. And for a lot of people, it signaled this real rejection of the court's authority.
And that's what's so scary, right? If that kind of thinking becomes the norm, then the whole legal system starts to break down.
Exactly. That's the worry.
Okay, so the second big argument for this being a crisis is this idea of dodging legal remedies.
Right. So the way our system works is if you don't like a court ruling, you appeal it, you go to a higher court, you make your case.
You don't just say, well, I'm not listening to that judge.
Exactly. And there's a great quote from Elizabeth Goitein. She's with the Brennan Center for Justice. She said, "The president's remedy is to appeal, not to defy."
Simple and to the point.
Right, and that's what's so concerning about this situation. The critics are saying the administration just skipped over that whole appeal process by rushing those deportations through.
So they basically shut down the system before it could even play out.
Exactly, and that undermines this core principle we have of judicial review. The court's ability to say, hey, is what the government doing here even constitutional?
Right, so it's not even just about this one case, it's about setting a precedent.
Exactly, and that's what has people so worried.
Okay, so argument number 3 for the crisis side is this whole thing about wartime powers and why using them in this context has so many legal experts waving red flags.
Yeah, so wartime powers are a big deal. They're spelled out in the Constitution, mainly in Article 2, and they're supposed to be reserved for really specific situations like a genuine national security threat or when we're actually in a war.
So not just anytime the president feels like it.
Definitely not. And a lot of legal experts are saying that using these powers to speed up the deportation of alleged gang members, even if those allegations are true, that it stretches the meaning of wartime powers way too far.
It's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Yeah, exactly. And historically, these powers have been used very cautiously, only in very extreme circumstances.
So the concern is that if we start using them more broadly, it could really blur the lines between normal law enforcement and these extraordinary national security measures.
Exactly. And that could set a dangerous precedent for the future.
Okay, so the final piece of the crisis argument that you highlighted has to do with Congress and the idea that their authority is being eroded.
Right. So remember, Congress is supposed to be a powerful check on the president. They make laws, they control the money, and they can even impeach the president if they need to.
So they're not just sitting around,
Not at all. But the concern here, and Sanford Levinson actually put it really bluntly, he said what we're seeing is a total and complete collapse of Congress as a genuine institution of governance.
Wow, that's a scathing assessment.
It is. And, part of what's feeding that perception is that even a lot of Republicans who used to push back against some of Trump's policies, they've basically fallen in line now.
So there's not as much resistance from within his own party.
Exactly. And that's what worries people. This lack of strong oversight from Congress could lead to a real imbalance of power. What some call an imperial presidency, where the president has way too much unchecked authority.
It's like the scales are tipping.
Exactly. And that's not how our system is supposed to work.
Okay, so we've heard a lot about why some people are calling this a constitutional crisis. But as you said, there's another side to this story. There are strong arguments against that label. And the first one is this idea that presidents have always pushed the limits. They've always tested the boundaries of their power.
Right. And this is a point that scholars like John Yoo have made very forcefully. He says, look, this kind of conflict between branches of government, it's not new. It's happened throughout American history.
So it's not like Trump is the first president to be a little power hungry.
Exactly. He points to examples like Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He actually suspended habeas corpus, which is a really fundamental legal.
Wow. So even in times of national crisis, there's precedent for presidents taking bold actions?
Exactly. And then there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He tried to pack the Supreme Court, appoint a bunch of new justices who would support his agenda.
Didn't really work out for him, though, did it?
No, it didn't. But the point is that these power struggles are kind of baked into the system. They're part of the design.
So it's not necessarily a sign that everything's falling apart.
Exactly. That's Yu's argument. It's more like a messy but ultimately functional dynamic.
Okay, so the second argument against this being a full-blown crisis is that the courts are still doing their job. They're pushing back against the administration's actions.
Right. Even with everything that's happened, the judicial branch is still functioning. Judge Boasberg issued that order. And like we said, there are appeals happening right now. And it's very possible that this whole thing will end up in the Supreme Court.
So it's not like the courts have been silenced or ignored.
Exactly. And it's significant that even some conservative judges have ruled against the Trump administration in certain cases.
So it's not just a partisan issue.
No, it's not. And that suggests that the system still has some checks and balances in place.
Okay. Argument number 3 on the no crisis side is that Congress still has the power to act, they just haven't fully used it yet.
Right. And there's definitely a lot of frustration with Congress, people saying they're not doing enough. But the point is they still have the constitutional authority to step in.
Like, what could they do specifically?
Or remember Senator Schumer? He talked about how some Republican senators are actually supporting the court rulings in these cases.
So there's potential for them to break with the president.
Exactly. And even more importantly, Congress could pass new laws, to clarify their intent on certain issues or to put limits on the president's power if they think he's overstepping.
So the tools are there, they just need to use them.
Exactly. And that's why some people are saying, hold on, this isn't a complete breakdown of the system. Congress still has a role to play.
Okay. And the final argument against calling this a crisis is that some people are saying it's more like constitutional hardball.
Right. So this is Sanford Levinson again, and he's making a really interesting distinction. He says, what we're seeing is not a collapse of the system, but a really aggressive strategy, exploiting every loophole and technicality to get a political win.
So it's like playing dirty, but it's still within the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's like pushing the system to its absolute breaking point, but not quite breaking it.
So it's still dangerous, but not a full-on meltdown.
Right. And he's arguing that the system might actually be strong enough to withstand even this level of pressure.
Okay, so we've looked at both sides of the argument, and it's a lot to take in. But looking ahead, what are the things we should be watching for? What will determine whether this situation actually escalates into a full-blown crisis?
Well, there are a few key things to keep an eye on. First of all, will the Supreme Court even agree to hear this case?
Right, because they don't have to take every case that comes their way.
Exactly. And if they do decide to hear it, their ruling will be huge. It'll set a precedent for how much power the president has in these kinds of situations.
So that's one big domino.
Exactly. And then there's Congress. Will they finally decide to flex their muscles, pass some new laws, reassert their authority?
That'll be telling for sure.
And then there's public opinion. How are the American people reacting to all of this? They could put a lot of pressure on both the president and Congress.
Right, because they have to answer to the voters in the end.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the big wild card. What will Trump do next? Will he keep pushing the boundaries? Will he defy more court orders?
It's like a game of chicken.
Yeah, and the stakes are incredibly high.
So we come back to that central question, is the U.S. system breaking or is it just bending under pressure?
Right. And on the one hand, you've got all these warning signs, the disregard for court orders, the potential overreach of executive power, the weakening of Congress. Those are all signs of a system under serious strain.
And on the other hand, there's this historical context. Presidents have always pushed the limits, and the courts are still fighting back, and Congress still has the power to act.
It's a really complex picture.
It is, and after digging into all of these sources, it's clear that there's no easy answer, but one thing's for sure, we're witnessing a really important test of our Constitution and the principles that it's based on.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, I think the big question to think about is, what does this mean for the future?
Yeah.
What does the balance of power really look like in the U.S. right now? And regardless of whether we call this a crisis or not, what are the long-term consequences of what we're seeing?
Right. Is this just a blip, or are we changing the rules of the game permanently?
Exactly. And that's something we all need to be thinking about because it affects all of us.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive, really thought-provoking.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
Thanks for bringing us these sources, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me.